Now? Yes. Lovely, thank you. Apologies for the confusion at the start. Welcome everyone to our panel session on the impossible war and the improbable peace, how to rebuild multilateralism during the new Cold War. We've got a fantastic panel of speakers. One of the things that I'm really keen to try and do, though, is involve the audience, you guys out there, as much as possible. So we're going to start. I'll do just a few intro comments, and I'll make some extremely short introductions to each speaker. You've got details in the app and in the program as well, so you can read much more about their hugely impressive backgrounds, track records, and expertise. But I'll ask each of them to say sort of a 5-minute sort of intro, and then I've got some questions, but I want to open it up to the audience as much as possible. So as people are speaking, do have a think about the questions that you want to ask, and I want to get you involved as early as possible. Is the general plan for the sort of next roughly 2 hours. We have something along those sort of lines. So what are we talking about? Well, look, amidst the shifting tides of global geopolitics, a new era has emerged, one that evokes memories of the Cold War, but brings with it unprecedented complexities. The world finds itself entangled in what some have termed the impossible war, characterized by rising tensions between major powers, ideological clashes, and strategic rivalries. As the geopolitical stage becomes increasingly reminiscent of Cold War bipolarity, it's essential to recognize the intricate dynamics that set this era apart. The conflicts that define this new age are far from simple. They encompass a blend of traditional and emerging threats, from territorial disputes and nuclear brinksmanship through to cyber warfare and economic rivalries. At its heart, this impossible war embodies a paradoxical fusion of both historical echoes and futuristic challenges. So in this context, the multilateral system, a linchpin of global diplomacy and cooperation, faces unprecedented challenges. Recent developments have shaken international organizations and alliances, raising questions about the efficiency of multilateralism in the face of evolving global dynamics. And the erosion of trust, which you see in a whole range of different reports and studies, politics through to business and further afield as well. That erosion of trust among nations looms large in an environment marked by heightened tensions. So look, lots and lots for us to sort of get involved in. Speakers, look, I say a huge range of experts here. Salam Kusti of the Ministry of Defence of the Republic of Estonia, Miran Korovic of the Republic of Croatia, Milton Finlay from Liberia, Bill Rammell from the UK, former minister in the UK, Gina Abercrombie-Winstanley from the Middle East Policy Council in the US, Carola Ramon, the Argentinian Council for International Relations, Marissa Kerman from the Middle East Programme at the Wilson Center, Ilan Berman from the American Policy Council in the US, Alexandra Malafay from the President of the Symposia of the French Republic, Abu Jazar Ramadan from the Brussels International Center for Research in Human Rights, Stravran Subotic from the European Centre for Council, and General Cheroke from the former head of the French military mission to the UN. So now it's always the short straws, who starts and who finishes. But I think I'll start with the general, and we'll work our way around this space at 5 minutes each, some general introductory comments, and then open up to questions. So, General, the floor is yours.
Merci beaucoup. Je trouve que pour parler de guerre, effectivement, c'est intéressant de faire venir un général et de parler de la guerre impossible. Nous avons une définition à l'école de guerre française qui est de dire que si on veut la paix, il faut préparer la guerre. Ceci ne veut pas dire la faire, mais la préparer. Et la paix improbable et le multilatéralisme. Alors j'entends sur tous les plateaux parler beaucoup de multilatéralisme. Moi qui me frappe, moi qui ai été beaucoup à New York auprès du Conseil de sécurité, c'est que parler du multilatéralisme, c'est en gros une décision commune, mais décider dans le multilatéralisme, c'est une autre paire de manches, si j'ose dire. Un comique français disait, lorsqu'un quelqu'un qui pèse 130 kilos et qui parle avec une grosse voix, celui qui pèse 60 kilos avec une petite voix l'écoute. Et je crois que c'est ce qu'il faut voir dans le multilatéralisme. C'est-à-dire que tout le monde doit pouvoir parler, tout le monde doit pouvoir écouter, et que la question, c'est la prise de décision. Ça n'est pas les échanges. Les échanges, évidemment, permettent de s'informer, permettent de se comprendre, permettent de voir quels sont les problèmes. Et dans les couloirs des Nations Unies, c'est un truc absolument extraordinaire. Il y a 193 pays et tout le monde peut se parler. Donc, et l'Assemblée générale des Nations Unies est là pour ça. Sauf que les décisions qu'elle prend, l'Assemblée générale, n'ont aucun point. Et donc la question, c'est lorsqu'on arrive au niveau du dessus, alors à l'ONU, c'est le Conseil de sécurité, c'est la prise de décision. Et là, il y a une articulation qui est intéressante, que j'ai pratiquée quotidiennement, qui est P3, P5, 15. Et donc, le multilatéralisme se réduit avec est-ce que 3 pays sont d'accord, États-Unis, Royaume-Uni, France, et est-ce que 5 pays sont d'accord, on rajoute la Chine et la Russie. Or, jusqu'à maintenant, ça se passait comme ça. Or, maintenant, ça ne se passe plus exactement comme ça. Il y a le P3 et il y a le P2, j'allais dire, dont on ne parle pas, mais qui est Russie-Chine. Et ensuite, il y a les 10 autres qui doivent se réunir. Donc, et c'est, je le rappelle, au Conseil de sécurité qu'on décide de la paix et de la guerre, de l'autorisation de la paix et de la guerre. Et là, je fais une petite parenthèse parce qu'il faut être court, mais j'entends beaucoup parler en ce moment de la Russie, et c'est juste qui, le 24 février, a rompu en étant un membre du P5, en déclarant la guerre, en faisant la guerre, contre toutes les conventions internationales. Mais doivent-ils s'en choquer? Mes amis américains ont fait exactement la même chose en 2003. En 2003, j'ai été au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies. Une décision unilatérale a été prise par les États-Unis de faire la guerre en Irak, et nous avons vu les conséquences que cela a causées dans l'ensemble du système au Moyen-Orient. Donc, aujourd'hui, j'allais dire, sur le système de décision et le respect des décisions prises à l'ONU, je mets les Russes et les Américains un peu dos à dos. Alors, évidemment, ça va choquer beaucoup de monde. Ce que je dis, c'est qu'il faut revoir, et je discutais avec un think tank chinois il n'y a pas longtemps, qui me disait de façon un peu gentille et naïve qu'il fallait que les grands s'entendent. Et comme tout le monde le sait, on parle de la réforme du Conseil de sécurité depuis 20 ou 30 ans. Et c'est à ce niveau-là qu'il y a des choses à faire. Je crois que le multilatéralisme, on le voit ici, on le voit à l'Assemblée générale, on le voit partout. Tout le monde est heureux de pouvoir échanger, de pouvoir communiquer, de pouvoir comprendre l'autre. Mais le problème, c'est au niveau des décisions, la paix et la guerre, ça se prend dans un petit cercle, et ce petit cercle doit être modifié. Je ne vais pas vous donner comment le faire, parce que ça fait 30 ans que les meilleurs diplomates travaillent dessus et n'y arrivent pas. Voilà, c'est ma petite phrase d'introduction.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm sure we'll return to some of those themes, particularly around decision-making process, as you say, General. Abu, over to you for your 5 minutes.
Je dois parler en arabe. Bonjour tout le monde. تحية لميديز، تحية للحضور الكريم، وأشكر الجنرال على كلمته المتوازنة. عودة الحرب الباردة أو الحديث عن الأقطاب حسب فهمنا، لأن العنوان كان غير واضح. الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية اتخذت قرار بتشكيل أحلاف جديدة عندما ذهبت وشكلت حلف الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، بريطانيا، أستراليا، ثم ذهبت إلى شرق آسيا وشكلت حلف اليابان، كوريا، الهند، أستراليا، الولايات المتحدة. مع العلم أن لديها حلف الناتو وهو الحلف الأكبر، واستثنى الحلفين أي دولة من الاتحاد الأوروبي. الصين الطامحة إلى عالم متعدد الأقطاب أيضا تنتشر في العالم عبر طموحها الاقتصادي ومشاريعها الاقتصادية وطريق الحرير التي تعتبره أحد أهم وسائلها لخلق عالم متعدد الأقطاب والخروج من هيمنة الدولار. ونحن نتحدث هنا عن انتشار اقتصادي. روسيا التي ارتكبت خطأ كارثيا كما ذكر الجنرال عندما قفزت عن الإجماع الدولي أو المعايير الدولية وحاولت، يمكن أن تكون استدرجت أو سوء حسابات من الرئيس بوتين، ولكن حاولت أن تأخذ حجمها عبر كارثة حربها ضد أوكرانيا، ضد رغبة وضد توجه العالم الذي خرج من أزمة كوفيد وكان يبحث عن حلول اقتصادية. هنا 3 محاور أسوأها المحور الأمريكي الذي لم يحترم التعهدات والاتفاقيات، وكانت الولايات المتحدة ولا زالت تشعر بأنها هي فوق كل التكتلات، لا تحترم التجمعات الأفريقية، تتظاهر بالاحترام ولكن تتعامل بعدم الاحترام، مع العلم أن كل المجتمع الدولي يحترم الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية وبحاجة إليها. لا زالت الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية هي الدولة الأعظم الأقوى اقتصاديا علميا. نحن بحاجة إلى الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية ولكن دون الطموح السياسي الأمريكي الذي لا يحترم ويؤجج النزاعات، أو دعنا نقول هناك خلافات إقليمية في كل مكان، وفي لحظة ما نعلم أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية تستطيع أن تحل بعض المشاكل، ولكنها تفضل دائما أن تدير الأزمات ولا تساهم في حل الأزمات. هنا العالم يبحث عن أقطاب أخرى، يريد أن يخرج من عباءة السياسة الأمريكية التي يصعب علينا فهمها سواء ديمقراطيين أو جمهوريين. لذلك نحن الآن على أبواب عودة تحديات إقليمية تشبه أجواء الحرب الباردة، ولكم الحق في الحديث بأننا نعود إلى أجواء الحرب الباردة ولكنها لم تعد باردة. مؤخرا شهدنا بوارج حربية، غواصات نووية تتحرك هنا وهناك. إذن القوة الأمريكية حاضرة على عكس ما كنا نتوقعه من الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية بعد سقوط الاتحاد السوفيتي. كنا نتوقع قطبا واحدا يعزز الأمن والسلم العالميين. شهدنا حروبا كثيرة ونزاعات كثيرة. هذه الحروب وهذه النزاعات بالمحصلة هناك من يتفق مع السياسة الأمريكية وهناك من لا يتفق، لذلك يذهبون إلى معسكرات جديدة، يطمح البعض لخلق محاور جديدة. شهدنا شبه محور صيني روسي إيراني ولكنه لم يكن فعال. الحقيقة أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية كانت ولا زالت وستبقى في المستقبل القريب الدولة الأقوى، الدولة الأعظم، المهيمنة، ولكن من حق الآخرين أن يقولوا لا عندما تتعارض مصالحهم مع الرؤية الأمريكية. شكرا سيد الرئيس، شكرا للجميع.
I think the translator is still going, yeah?
Okay, I was just making sure that I was not cutting anybody off by not again. So, thank you, Ilan. I'm sure there's one or two of those comments that you might want to pick up on others as well. But yeah, your thoughts.
I do actually. So I'm going to come back to it.
That's
but
fine.
The thing that I want to talk about is something that we haven't addressed before, not directly. But I'm a firm believer in the idea that you have to know how you got here to know where you're going. And so you framed it, I think, very well in the context of the new Cold War, right? The animating dynamics. There's obviously a Middle Eastern dynamic. There's a Eastern European dynamic, with Russia. But the animating dynamic, as we're seeing from Washington, that I've spent a lot of time on, is the U.S.-China, the emergence of great power competition. And this is driven, I think, by this, I'm not sure awakening is the proper word, but this sort of realization, this reformulation of policy that's taken place in Washington. So where we were, if we remember, were two concepts. The concept articulated by President Obama in his November 2011 speech before the Australian Parliament of a pivot to Asia, which was then later renamed a rebalance to Asia, but then very clearly in the language it was a pivot to Asia. In that geopolitical context, totally appropriate, right? Xi Jinping had not yet risen to power in Beijing. Asia was seen as a theater of boundless economic opportunity. The Middle East was enormously troublesome in terms of regional conflicts, sectarian conflicts, and strife. And so that impulse was, I think, very understandable. And it was underpinned by another concept, and it was a concept that had been articulated 6 years earlier by then Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick, right, when he talked about responsible stakeholder, making China a responsible stakeholder, right? And the premise was actually very simple, but it's something that's animated U.S. policy towards China for at least a quarter of a century. The idea that through greater integration into international institutions, multilateral institutions, international fora, you would be able to shape, in very large measure, shape Chinese policy towards the international order. You would make them a responsible stakeholder in the existing international order. What's really changed over the last 4 years or so began under the Trump administration, but has been reaffirmed in a different fashion under the Biden administration, is a realization that the concept of responsible stakeholder was bankrupt, that it is possible to integrate China into multilateral institutions, but it's not possible to change Chinese core interests. The Chinese have their own vision of the world. They, in fact, have an economic and ideological model, and they are navigating the system, but they're not compromising their view of the world, their view of the rise of the Middle Kingdom. And so that's sort of how we got to great power competition, as first articulated in the national security strategy that the Trump administration put out, and has since been affirmed through all sorts of language on the part of the Biden administration. President Biden came in talking about great power competition, then it became long-term strategic competition, then it became something less, it became managed competition, and now we're sort of backing away, right? We just had President Biden's summit with Xi Jinping in San Francisco, which was a lot of emphasis on the tactical areas of commonality. Is it possible to work on drugs? Is it possible to work on deconfliction mechanisms? But the larger intellectual contest is still present. We still have deep reservations about how China styles itself in terms of the global order. The idea that China is wooing countries in the global south to its side and in the process away from the United States, right? These are all problems that still remain. And this is sort of leads me to where we're going. The result is that what you're looking at in terms of American policy, and at least for the next couple of years, I think, is a more balanced American approach, as Biden calls it, a managed competition that seeks to look for tactical areas of cooperation. But that larger trend line towards competition still exists, and I don't think it's going to go away. And this raises all sorts of hard questions for American allies in the developing world, because the Chinese value proposition, as compared to the American value proposition, has been a topic of enormous conversation. We talked about it at this conference. We've talked about it at this conference last year, Stuart, as you remember. The attractiveness of the Chinese model of lending and investing is, I think, enormous for countries that are seeking to improve the lot of their domestic populations, that are seeking to solidify their hold on power, all these things, right? Chinese money comes with far less strings attached. But the global south is not an undifferentiated mass. There are countries that are aspiring to first world status. There are countries that are improving their economy. Morocco is one of these countries. Countries that are leveling up qualitatively and quantitatively in terms of how they rank on global indices of democracy, of freedom, of economic prosperity. For those countries, the equation, I think, is a little bit trickier, because in Washington we say there's no such thing as a free lunch. I don't know how that translates into French, but it sounds very good in English. And I think that phrase is actually very apt, because it's tempting to think of Chinese investment as a value-free proposition. But we know that in line with Chinese lending comes the entry of Chinese technology firms, comes the entry of sort of all the attendant security problems that come along with companies like ZTE and Huawei, and so on and so forth. And behind that is a larger ideological compact, a trade-off that the Chinese people have already made and that China wants the countries of the developing world to make. It's a trade-off between prosperity and liberty. It's a trade-off between prosperity and economic stability and freedom of expression. That is a trade-off that some countries are willing to make. But I think every country, as they try to navigate this new environment, needs to have a really sober understanding of what they're being asked to do by the United States, but also what they're being asked to do by China. So I'll stop there.
No, thank you. That's a point well made about the challenges and the decisions that individual countries have to make depending on how they see their futures. And as you say, it's not none of these things are easy, but they need to be considered at the outset. Caroline, your comments.
Thank you. Good morning. I think after what you just said, I'm going to change completely what I was thinking of saying.
Sorry.
No, because I'm going to build up on what you were saying. I think we are all navigating these uncharted waters of this so-called Cold War. And on the one hand, we have the post-Bretton Woods multilateralism and its institutions, which are clearly under attack and challenge, partly because some of us feel that we are not getting what we want from those institutions, and these institutions are not delivering to some countries, and this was more evident after the COVID, with the wars, without reaching the SDGs objectives. There are lots of things happening that is just not delivering to the less developed countries. And on the other hand, you see a type of globalization, which I for many years been calling globalization with Chinese characteristics. Now in China, everything is said, well, we are capitalists with Chinese characteristics. The Chinese characteristics, no one really knows what they are. It's just a term to use to explain something that's unexplainable, and that's very Chinese. And so the globalization with Chinese characteristics, what is it? China has become a member of all the post-Bretton Woods institutions, but also has been replicating and building a whole new range of new institutions, a new type of globalization with the Belt and Road Initiative, with more presence in BRICS that's now being enlarged. I mean, it's a whole new world. So basically you have these two models, the post-Bretton Woods institutions and the globalization with Chinese characteristics. Now what happens is that for the countries that are in the middle, and not middle power or middle income countries, but literally the countries that are stuck in the middle of these two models, we feel, and speaking from countries from the south, that we permanently have to choose between one model or the other. And now a lot's being said about the new trend of friendshoring and shifting supply chains to your friends, but friendshoring doesn't have a proper definition. Who is my friend? Who has democratic values, those who share trade values? Who is our friend? And by choosing the most important thing for countries, for less developed countries, in Africa and Latin America in particular, is what happens if we are chosen as a friend and we decide to be friends with someone. Does that mean we are enemy with the other? And does it have any consequences? In Argentina, for instance, now we are in the middle of elections. We have presidential elections tomorrow. One of the most heated debates was whether Argentina was going to accept the invitation to BRICS or not. One candidate wants to join BRICS, the other one wants to be out. And that is simply because of a perceived alignment with China against the US. The same thing when we joined the Belt and Road Initiative. I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at that time, and we worked a lot in trying to keep a balance and signing the Belt and Road by giving the right signals to the US that we were not committing 100% with China. Now, I don't think that the southern countries or the middle countries should be having to navigate this all the time. And I think the new type of multilateralism that has to arise. And I think partly there is hope in the sense that when you look at all the multilateral institutions, there's been what I call the interpollinization of them, and it's been seen particularly in the pandemic. There's no niche talks. They just talk to each other, and WTO talks about topics that are replicated at the World Health Organization and the Labor Organization. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But I think the way out of this Cold War, and there's a role for the middle countries to be mediators in this Cold War and to establish and reset the agenda that really works for everyone, and that also it will help everyone, especially the southern countries, to bear the brunt of the external shocks much better. And also we have something that's very important these days, and there are two concepts that are debated in every single fora, and that's energy security and food security. The so-called global south has the key to unlock both concepts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Well, a huge number of topics that we could talk about. I do quite like the idea of well, not I don't like the idea, but the institutions being siloed and needing new mediators to try and bring some of these actors together. So again, we can maybe pick up on some of those things as we continue our session. Milton. Sorry, you could everybody else hear? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, Milton. Sorry if you.
Well, thank you. Cold War, is it an illusion? Is it created deliberately to create a situation where the South is treated in a way that we believe that we have to look up to this globalization? This illusion is all about economic power and political dominance. As the population grow, resources are becoming more and more important to the rest of the world. And of course, the superpowers have created this illusion for us to believe that this Cold War still exists. It's no longer about diplomacy or bilateral relationships. It's about economics. It's as simple as that. How do we approach it? What approach is best to address some of the issues that are creating the conflict in the world today? You take the European situation with Ukraine, Russia. You take the Middle East. Africa itself have its own unique crisis. And how do we address that in this globalization? The United Nations is there and step in all the time. But the Security Council itself, which is the nucleus of addressing conflict, comprises of the United States, China, Russia, Great Britain, and France. So that is why I believe there's an illusion. They all sit there and they know the problem, they know the issues, and what we're seeing today in both capitals of the United States, the capital of Russia, still have the embassy running and functioning. The capital of China and the United States, you still have a thriving diplomatic relationship. What do you expect us to believe in the South? Who creating the situation of the conflict? How do we prevent these conflicts? I believe that the Security Council needs to be expanded to include the South. so that we can sit at the table where decisions are being made with the same veto power that all the Security Council members have. To be able to address peace adequately, we have to include some of the nations that have these major differences and conflicts. The other issue that we want to raise, what are the instruments used in these conflicts? Weapons. Who manufacture weapons? The same Security Council members. They are the major producer of weapons in the world. And they have to take the steps that are necessary to start to prevent some of these conflicts. They have to also take the diplomatic position of being able to address peace in the world. With them, I believe that this world is going to be a peaceful place. With them, I believe that they can minimize the conflicts that are popping up around the world. I would like to conclude. I will not speak long. I think I'll prefer to see a debate on this matter. I would like to conclude by saying that it is up to the Security Council, the superpowers, to decide the direction of this new global peace initiative. If they are ready for peace, I believe that the rest of the world will be a peaceful place. If they decide to do so, I would respectfully submit at this point. Thank you.
Milton, thank you. If I can just ask you one question, sorry, I'm abusing my chair's position by already stopping everybody else from speaking, but do you see much appetite from the Security Council for that change, or are you a little sceptical that they will open themselves up to a wider membership, as you suggest?
Well, I don't think they will open themselves up to a membership, because it's been almost 30 years or so since this issue have been raised. Well, what I do believe is that there are new players emerging. You got Brazil emerging. You got India emerging. And I think these are new players that you are seeing from Asia, from the South, coming up and trying to step up. Africa is also trying to do that. So I think with that, the space is being opened forcefully, not in the diplomatic scene, but in the economic scene. When you have Brexit coming, I think that will also help to address some of these economic issues, which will put more pressure on some of these, the Security Council.
Brilliant, thank you. Miro, you're next. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I've been hesitating between speaking French and English. I'm gonna go for English today. This time for English. Next time for French. Good. Basically, what is going on? We have again a great power competition, and this is the key to understanding what is going on in the world. President Biden, he delivered a speech before the United Nations in September, and he said, I quote, "The institutions we built together at the end of the Second World War are an enduring bedrock of our progress, and the United States is committed to sustaining them." So what is going on? The Americans, logically, as the winners of World War II, and being the leaders of the West, they organized, as George Shultz said it once, the global commons. So the rules we have today basically are the rules which were formulated by the winners of the war, Second World War, the Americans, also the Soviets. Soviet Union is gone. And now we have the Chinese, who have become much stronger, who moved from 2% of GDP share, PPP, in 1980 to 20% in 5 years. And that's the big change. The question, of course, is if you are the United States of America, you're the ruler of the world in a certain sense. No Soviet Union anymore. Russia was weak. It's become stronger. Are you willing to accept to share power? And that's the basic problem. The Americans, logically, are trying to uphold their power. The Chinese are becoming stronger and stronger. Mr. Xi, he was in San Francisco. He was called a dictator by Mr. Biden. In fact, Mr. Biden, he was right, because China is, if you look at the constitution of China, China is a dictatorship because you have the Communist Party leading the country. It's not an offense. He just told the truth. But in fact, Xi didn't care, because he left for San Francisco. He left afterwards to meet people from Silicon Valley. Among them was also Mr. Musk. So things are changing. Businessmen need the Chinese market. So basically, the United States today is in a situation in which the United Kingdom was before World War I, when you had the Germans becoming stronger and stronger, and you had the La Crise d'Agadir, a confrontation between the French and the Germans and the Agadir Bay. In the end, there was no war, because Joseph Caillaux, as the Prime Minister of France, he negotiated. But 3 years later, there was a war. The next trigger was the killing of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo. So the question today is, for us coming from states which are not a great power, if we will have two great powers today sticking to reason. What Kissinger said, I hope there will be no confrontation. And that's why what we need the middle powers to work efficiently to create an atmosphere that will hinder the great powers from going to a confrontation. This is how I see things. This is all we can do. This is what the Germans can do, the French can do, the British can do. We can do in Croatia, for instance, at a lower level, of course. This is all we can, because there's a mechanism going on, a mechanism of confrontation, which is in a certain way natural for great power. Because why should I, as an American, I'm a Croatian, give up power if I'm not compelled to do that? So we can only hope that reason will prevail, and there will be no confrontation, as there was no big confrontation in the past between the Americans and the Soviets. There will be no nuclear war, no war based on artificial intelligence. And when we speak about multilateral organizations, they are important, they are a bedrock, but they are something which are basically applied by the less powerful states, because the most important states will always have a special status, and they will put up the rules for our world. One of the rare places in the world, but there we have no great powers anymore, where we have some kind of garden, what Burrell said, is the European Union. But the European Union member states, even the biggest ones, are not great powers anymore, and they lost the capacity to act strategically, as the war Russia waged against Ukraine shows, as the war now Israel leads against Hamas leads. European Union is not important as such. So it's not, you cannot apply it to the world scene, but this is one example where that could work, but this is a very idealistic approach, and which is not probable, since I'm a realist. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
And do you see much evidence of those middle powers working together to challenge some of those existing institutions there, or not?
Right now, what we see is that the middle powers, this is my personal view, they are not courageous enough, and I'll say something very brutal. They lack many leaders lack la culture générale. President de Gaulle used to say or wrote in a book in the 30s. La culture générale. They don't have enough knowledge to lead the world, unfortunately. I'm sorry for that.
Slightly depressing, but never mind. Gina,
Wow, okay.
you've got to follow that now. So.
I certainly want to associate myself with many things that my colleagues have said already. I also wanted to put out there that it is not a monolithic way of thinking about great power competition. Having been a diplomat for 30 plus years working in capitals that are not the European Union or Russia or China, my colleagues and I spent a lot of time and energy and intellectual energy trying to make the case that the United States government needs to heed other voices than simply the Security Council or Five Eyes, if we include New Zealand and Canada for some of the things that we work on internationally. Certainly with the beginning of this administration, there was a lot of discussion as the campaign began as to what the world should look like. And there were several of us who were dismayed to see everything once again put in pockets of great power competition and how Russia might see it and what we might do to counter Russia or to counter China. And in these discussions, there was a complete absence of what the people in the particular region might think about this. It might be Russia and the United States in the Middle East with no discussion of Syria or Lebanon or Egypt or Israel, etc. I mean, it was quite shocking for those of us who thought we had moved further away from simply great power competition. But that is a lot of work to go beyond the Security Council. It's complex. You have to take in a lot of different ways of thinking about it. It's messy. And a lot of diplomats and leaders don't want to do it because it takes too much energy. They'd much rather have a couple of people rule the world, as my colleagues have pointed out. We increasingly see that is not possible. And the conflict in the Middle East between Hamas and Israel is a perfect example of that. Russia, China, United States, to a certain extent, are not the main players. As we look for those who are in the negotiations for releasing hostages, we're talking about Qatar, Egypt, Jordan. And so these regional groupings, these regional voices that need to be listened to and adhered to are getting louder and making their presence and weight known. And personally, I think this is a better way. So I think I'm going to leave it there because lots has been said and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
No, thank you, Gina. Thank you for that. Sam, uniquely placed geographically as well. So you're not just in the table, but in European terms as well. So your comments.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you for the invitation and what a fascinating panel, almost 360 degrees view around the world. Indeed, I will address the way we see the current situation from our part of the world. And clearly this is not an abstract situation. The world order as it stands is being disputed every single day. And concretely, it's not a Cold War, it's a very, very sizzling hot war going on in Ukraine. In order to speak about the change, we need to be very clear about what is at stake. What are we fighting war and what do we have to win and what do we have to lose? And the way we see it, it's not only the trenches in the eastern Ukraine that is at stake. There is much, much, much more. Primarily, the right for individual nations to choose their own destiny. That is what is at stake. And this is what Russia is disputing, and this is what will design the world as we see it in the future. policy of sphere of influences is at what's at stake. Russia believes that there should be ability for larger nations to impose its will on smaller nations. That is what he tries to prove there. This is that he doesn't dislike, and that is what at stake. And this is what we need to fight against. If this will be tolerated, there will be an open door for new conflicts in the world. That is something that needs to be ruled out. A lot has mentioned before, but rule of law, UN Charter, international law, this is everything point blank white has been violated. The way we tackle this, the way we tolerate this will define the future as it is. And not in the laws, but in the actual practice how the law is being applied. And it's a serious matter. I mean, there is no point of convening these conferences in the future and patronizing about the laws if we let this thing go through. And I think maybe even most importantly, what we need to rule out as a result of this war in Ukraine, the aggression as a tool in itself. You cannot attack other countries, and that's how it is. And it's also important how this war has been depicted. It's not a regional conflict. It's not a war between two Slavic nations. It's one larger country attacking another one. And this is how it is. And this is why it's illegal, it's so brutal, and this is why it should never happen again. And if we speak about aggression as a tool, then it's not only occupying other nations, occupying territories. This is much, much more. It's about imposing your will to other nations. It's disrupting unity. It's going after the basic platform of all the values that we stand for. And I think being Estonian, we are a little bit in a very privileged position to speak about this because we are a laboratory example of both sides of the coin. We were occupied in the 40s by Russia, exactly in the same terms as they are trying to do in Ukraine now. It was colonization, basically. It was nothing different at the time. The destiny that we share with a lot of nations in Africa is exactly the same. Larger countries came and took our liberty, took our ability to self-determine our destiny. The same deportations were ongoing in 40s and in early 50s in Estonia. My grandfather was taken away to Siberia when he was 17. Well, luckily he returned, and well, luckily for me as well. But hundreds of thousands didn't. And this is exactly what is going on there, and this is something that needs to be ruled out. And we have also the second side of the same coin. The corruption-free, free market-oriented, democratic, self-fulfilling nations will lead to a success. We regained our independence in 91. Our GDP has 40-folded, 40 in 30 years, 40 times richer. The foreign direct investments are 90 times higher than it was in 91. We are the home for one of the greatest innovations in the world, and our e-governance and Skypes and TransferWise and so forth. How many unicorns, 1 billion companies have you heard of in Donbass, for example? Or Southern Ossetia? Well, not very much, because corruption and oppression don't usually get to the economic freedom and self-fulfillment of the nations. So we need to be clear what's at stake here and not sort of paint this as a very sort of abstract question. On multipolar world, it's a good term because the meaning of this term can be 180 degrees different depending on who's talking about this. When Russia speaks about multipolar world, then what does he mean? Well, he clearly means that there are a few polars, and then these polars will define the destiny of other nations, or imposing their will, and everyone needs to do according to their rules. When Estonia speaks about multipolar world, and many other smaller nations are speaking about this, then we speak about the rules, international law, willingness to choose our own destiny, to build our strengths to our power of self-fulfillment. This is what we are speaking about. And I think this is something that we need to advocate for and go after. And another thing that we need to remind ourselves that the world order as such won't change when the ultimate result of the Ukrainian war will surface. It might take ages when it will actually be fixed. It will change at the moment when the free, democratic, freedom-loving nations will accept what's going on there. And this might happen way, way before when the actual war fighting will end. So that's what's at stake, and that is the historic role of all of us to make sure that we move towards the positive and not the negative territory. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan. Again, I'm going to abuse my position slightly, and apologies if this is a completely simplistic question, but particularly what Russia have done with Ukraine. Do the people of Estonia, the other republics, do they worry now that if Russia is successful in Ukraine, that they could be next? Is it a daily worry? Is it there, or is it sort of slightly put to one side? Apologies. That's
Well, the answer is, of course, very simple. Of course we worry. I mean, Russia has made it clear that what his intent is. I mean, there is not a single person, I think, in transatlantic, when it was in NATO, who would doubt that this is a realistic scenario. We had President Biden in his televised speech drawing this out. We had Secretary Austin saying 4 weeks ago that if Ukraine loses the war, then NATO will win next, and this is imminently happening. I think that's the diagnosis is being clear, and Russia has made no secret about this.
Thank you. Sorry, Marissa.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and it's a pleasure to be here with so many distinguished colleagues from all around the world. I'm going to sort of pull the conversation to another theater of great power competition, and that's the Middle East. I think if you would ask people pre-October 7th, where the United States has re-engaged very proactively and aggressively, of course, in the aftermath of Hamas's attack on Israel and the ongoing war in Gaza, most leaders, most opinion leaders would tell you that there has been a vacuum in or disengagement of the United States in the Middle East. And this is why we've seen great power competition emerge in a way that rattled a lot of people in the US when they saw the China-Arab summit hosted in Riyadh, for example, or China, quote unquote, brokering a rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I think for many people in the region, or particularly, looking out at US engagement, there was the sense that we need to ensure that we invest in different baskets for economic reasons, for national economic reasons, but for political reasons as well. That's not to say that they will rely on either Russia and China for any type of military umbrella or security umbrella. But on the economic front, given their location, given their own economic interests, that's definitely the direction that many of the regional powers have taken, namely in the GCC, because that's the power center, powerful energy and economic center of the region. The war on Ukraine really did shift people's interest in how the region was going to respond to Russia's invasion. And I think that was sort of one of the first tests to how a lot of the US allies were going to react. Many of them to date have not condemned Russia's invasion and have opened their doors for Russian investments and continue to be on the list of countries that have not enacted sanctions against Russia. But they remain to be important allies and partners on many other fronts with the United States. What we've also seen as a result of this sort of disengagement, but also a new approach that my colleagues, Madame Ramon, talked about in terms of a lot of the middle countries feeling that they have to choose between one, polar versus another, or one great power versus another, is not only ensuring that we put different eggs in different baskets, but also pursuing alliances, initiatives that are new, that are more a la carte, that focus on economic interests. And Monsieur Findlay already mentioned the importance of these economic interests driving a lot of these initiatives. So, for example, in the region, the Abraham Accords came to a surprise to many people in the region, because there was already an agreement in 2002 led by Saudi Arabia, the Arab Peace Initiative, that promised Israel normal relations with the rest of the Arab world only after the end of Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and a creation of an independent Palestinian state. But the Abraham Accords came in a very different direction, normalizing relations, because the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, Morocco as well, have looked at it in a very different way, pursuing their own national interests. And with the United Arab Emirates in particular, we've seen so many economic agreements, free trade agreements, other penned agreements on science, technology, military security, and the list goes on. And with that, we've seen other initiatives emerge, whether it's I2U2, for example, that was the India, United Arab Emirates, Israel alliance that, and with the support of the United States, that is looking at various economic cooperations, agreements and investments on particularly energy, food security, etc. And right before, in September, I think maybe late summer, the emergence of the Middle East, India, Europe economic corridor. So a lot of these initiatives have been emerging with many of the middle powers in the region finding their way to pursue their economic interests, but also reaching out to various powers, knowing that it's not only a matter of choosing one side or one great power, and again, making sure that this is how they can preserve their own security, stability, but primarily move into a new direction where it's not only complete dependence on one great power and complete loyalty to just one great power. I'll stop right here. Thank you.
Thank you. So the idea that countries can have different arrangements with different organisations, different countries, depending on their needs, rather than being sort of effectively one size fits all. This is how we approach things,
and that it's not you are either with us or against us mentality. That I think, when the Saudis, for example, in multiple occasions, during OPEC Plus, did not really oblige to U.S. requests with regards to balancing the energy markets. The Saudis came out and said, well, this is our own national economic interest. It's sometimes read differently in Washington, in other parts of Europe, given the impact on Europe, on the United States, and the importance of these issues domestically. And so I think that's at the heart of this, that we've heard other colleagues talk about how these voices are emerging, but they're also moving in the direction of, well, we need to pursue our own national interests. And with that, we're also aware of the global dynamics.
That reminds me of the old saying, there are no permanent friends, just permanent interests. And that's exactly right. Yeah.
Thank you. Bill.
Stuart, thank you. The credentials I bring to this debate are as a former UK Foreign Office minister, and in that regard, I was the first and still the only British minister to go and negotiate in North Korea. And if anything convinces you of the need for multilateralism effectively, it's engaging with North Korea. I think we've had an interesting debate. I think multilateralism, collaboration between nations in pursuit of common goals, is challenged as I've never known it before at the moment in my adult political lifetime. Ukraine, where Putin has launched the largest conflict on the continent of Europe since the Second World War, illegal, unprovoked and unjustifiable war. I think the international response was concerted, but there's a risk now that I think that is waning. And if we're being candid, the opposition to Russia's actions has not been uniform across the global south. And I hear the arguments that the global south doesn't want to choose between sides. I think ultimately, if we are to make progress and democracy, liberalism, human rights is on the agenda, I think ultimately there is a choice to be made. And I think that needs to be engaged upon. We've had the horrifying conflict in Gaza, the awful Hamas terrorist attacks. So of course Israel has the right to self-defense, but Israel has to adhere to international law. And I think the effective multilateral response has been faltering, and bluntly has been faltering over the last 75 years in terms of moving towards a two-state solution. Myanmar, where the junta has carried out a brutal nationwide crackdown of millions of people opposed to its rule, and bluntly the international community has stood on the sidelines and done nothing. Iran, a malign force for instability, promoting terrorism in the region and the world, presiding over the repression of human rights and developing nuclear weapons. The Iran nuclear deal, I think, was an effective multilateral response, but Trump withdrew and shattered that multilateral response, and Iran is closer to nuclear capability than ever. The gulf between China and the West greater than ever. And every security analyst I ever spoke to when I was a Foreign Office Minister said the most likely terrain for World War III was over Taiwan. And that presents a really formidable, challenging situation. We've seen the crumbling of collective political and economic regional blocs that have been a force for multilateralism. For example, Brexit, in my view, the biggest act of national self-harm my country has ever inflicted on itself, but driven by nationalism and populism. So I think there's a lot to be depressed about. The challenges to multilateralism, providing collaborative, effective responses to these crises and others, are profound. Terrorism more widespread, ever more disdainful of human rights, powered in this new age by technology, a fundamentally divided collective security situation, and a gulf in interests, common ground, and a shared worldview between China and Russia on the one part, and the West is wider than ever. And engagement with the global South within that, I think, has been lacking. A growth across the planet of nationalism, a worldwide regressive trend, country first, all other values second, and that drives against establishing common grounds and common goals. And the growth of populism, the false dichotomy of the people against the elite, with the populists, ironically, often part of those elites, but providing simplistic solutions to very complex problems and solutions that don't work. Trump, Brexit, Bolsonaro, Meloni, Putin, all of that presses against effective multilateralism. And the prospect of Trump coming back to the White House, and whatever you think about the US, you need US leadership and engagement in multilateralism. And America first, and detaching America from the world, I think, is a huge, huge challenge moving forward. So, as I said, it's easy to get depressed and daunted, but it was the Italian Marxist Gramsci who said, you need pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the spirit. And I think there are ways forward, and I think there are grounds for optimism. Establishing common ground through leadership, dialogue, and negotiation, seeking agreement that the international community will challenge terrorism, aggression, and repression of human rights. I think we should revisit the doctrine of international community put forward by my former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in 2005, to establish a right and a duty of humanitarian intervention to protect civilians. We need much greater urgency in UN reform, particularly around the Security Council. We've talked about it for almost 30 years, but not progressed. We know regionally who the new permanent members should be: Japan, Germany, Nigeria, India, Brazil. We need the current permanent 5 to move on that, and we need the neighbours of those countries to stop lobbying to block them. And it's crucial that they don't become permanent members wielding vetoes. And I think if we're to make real progress at the UN, we need to tackle the issue of the current five having the veto. We need a stronger role in terms of leadership for the G20 as a driving force for international collective action. We saw that happen in the wake of the 2008 banking crisis, where, you know, the G20 was galvanized, $1.1 trillion mobilized to bring economic stability, and that needs to be taken forward. And we need stronger regional economic blocs throughout the world. Yes, they are self-interested, but they're also a force for stability. And Africa has to be engaged in the politics and the process of all of this. Progress is desperately needed, and yes, there's altruism here, but there's fundamental self-interest as well, and it should guide all of us. We need hope, confidence, but above all, political will.
Bill, thank you for some upbeat solutions as well as the more pessimistic points that you make as well. Alexandra.
Bonjour à tous. Je vais parler dans la langue de Molière, qui est une très belle langue aussi. On n'a pas beaucoup parlé ce matin, en tout cas, j'ai pas beaucoup entendu le mot peuple, les gens. Et je voudrais citer en préambule de mon petit mot ce triste mot de Paul Valéry, qui était un poète, écrivain français. Il disait « La guerre, c'est le massacre des gens qui ne se connaissent pas au profit des gens qui se connaissent et qui ne la font pas. » Voilà. On parle de ça aujourd'hui. Parce qu'effectivement, on n'est pas dans un monde de guerre froide. Guerre froide, c'était un monde bipolaire, figé, dans lequel il y avait un certain ordre mondial. L'ordre des puissances, certes, mais l'ordre. Aujourd'hui, l'ordre mondial, ça a été dit, j'y reviendrai un instant, ne marche pas, ne marche plus. L'ordre mondial, le multilatéralisme est mort, clairement. Donc, à partir de là, on a un problème absolument majeur, parce que c'est le retour du droit du plus fort. C'est lui qui, aujourd'hui, effectivement, dicte les règles. C'est rien d'autre. Alors, le multilatéralisme est mort en 2003, le général Franklin l'a mentionné, parce qu'effectivement, les Américains ont commis une guerre illégale, mais malheureusement, 4 des 5 membres du Conseil de sécurité ont commis des actes répréhensibles, parfois avec le soutien de la communauté internationale, mais avec des guerres critiquées. Le seul qui n'a pas commis d'actes répréhensibles en dehors de ses frontières, c'est la Chine, mais ça ne suffit pas à refaire le monde. Voilà. Donc on a un vrai problème de crise du multilatéralisme. Or, le multilatéralisme, ça sert à quoi? Ça sert à faire de la paix. S'il y a la paix, on peut avoir de la prospérité. Maintenant, on peut aussi s'occuper de la planète, c'est le 3e P. Tout ça pour le peuple, les peuples. C'est de ça dont on parle. Or ça ne marche plus. Et je fais un petit clin d'œil à mon pays qui, sous l'initiative du président Macron, a lancé il y a quelques années un forum de Paris sur la paix en 2018. Il n'y a jamais eu autant de guerres ou de conflits que depuis le 18 si on refait l'histoire récente des 50 dernières années. Donc oui, on a un sujet. Et le sujet, c'est qu'en plus, la réforme de l'ONU, tant attendue, tant souhaitée, sur laquelle tant travaille depuis des décennies, elle n'aura pas lieu. En tout cas, pas à court terme, pas avant qu'il y ait une 3e guerre mondiale. Pourquoi? Parce que quels sont les 5 membres du Conseil qui vont accepter de lâcher leurs prérogatives? Quels sont les 5 membres du Conseil? Lequel d'entre eux? Peut-être la France. Peut-être la France au nom d'une espèce de bien-pensance mondiale, en disant « Ah, ce serait peut-être pas mal que… » Oui, mais enfin, avant qu'on le fasse, il va quand même falloir qu'on réfléchisse à éviter les bêtises quand même. Donc quel est celui qui va aussi accepter le droit de la réforme du veto de l'ONU? Je ne crois pas. Je n'y crois pas un seul instant. Donc je crois qu'on a une vraie crise mondiale. Elle est très ennuyeuse parce qu'effectivement, pour l'instant, c'est des rapports de force, du pouvoir et des richesses. Parce que bien sûr, tout le monde veut plus de richesses, tout le monde veut plus de ressources, la démographie est l'enjeu majeur. On est trop nombreux sur Terre, 8 milliards, 9 milliards, 10 milliards. Je ne sais pas comment faire autrement, personne n'a la solution. Mais ça met une pression phénoménale sur l'ensemble de la planète. Donc, pour régler ça, il faut des règles, et il faut de la volonté. Des règles ne marchent plus, la volonté, il n'y en a pas. Le cynisme, les faux semblants, les intérêts nationaux priment sur tout le reste, dans des logiques de rapport de force. Alors il y a une crise du Conseil de sécurité, il y a une crise de l'ONU, mais il y a aussi une crise de l'Occident. Et je voudrais juste dire que la crise de l'Occident, ce n'est pas un projet de société. Hein. Le reste du monde peut nous rejeter aussi longtemps qu'il le voudra, ce n'est pas un projet de société. De la même manière que le rejet d'Israël et le fait de le virer de sa zone géographique, ce n'est pas non plus un projet qui marchera. En Israël, je ne sais pas s'il y a une solution, mais en tout cas avec Gaza et avec la Palestine, mais le jour où les pays arabes prendront leurs responsabilités autrement qu'en disant au revoir Israël, peut-être qu'on trouvera une solution. Parce que c'est peut-être finalement pas aux Juifs de gérer les Arabes. Enfin, je le dis de manière un peu brutale, mais je pense qu'il y a d'autres voies que la confrontation. Alors il y a des choses qui marchent, il faut s'en réjouir, il faut les observer. Je vais prendre pour le coup un élément qui me rend optimiste parce que c'est possible. Quand on a connu le prix de la vie, le prix du sang, le prix du drame pendant un siècle, ce qui est le cas du continent de l'Union européenne, on a inventé à partir de 1945 un cadre qui s'appelle l'Union européenne et qui fonctionne tant bien que mal. Ça fait quand même 80 ans qu'on ne s'est pas, pardonnez-moi d'être un peu trivial, foutu sur la gueule entre 27 ou 28 pays. Et d'ailleurs, tous les pays qui sont autour veulent rentrer. Donc ça fonctionne. Voilà. Et ce n'est pas simplement un cadre économique. Parce que l'intégration économique, ça ne suffit pas. C'est bien, mais ça ne suffit pas. Parce que d'abord, ça se fait souvent au détriment des uns contre les autres. Hein, ça, c'est assez clair, malheureusement. Ça va plus que ça. Parce que c'est un cadre juridique. C'est un continent de droit dans lequel il y a des valeurs, il y a un ordre, et il y a une capacité à exercer des pressions sur les pays. Et ça aussi, il faut l'accepter. Parce que si on revient au fondement du multilatéralisme, il faudra qu'il y ait un jour, dans des zones déterminées, il y ait la capacité à agir, à interagir, à dire à un pays, parce qu'à la base, pour qu'il y ait prospérité et qu'on s'occupe de la planète, il faut la paix. Et pour la paix, il faut qu'il y ait la sécurité. Et pour qu'il y ait la sécurité, à un moment donné, il faut que les pays acceptent des règles communes, y compris des règles d'intrusion. Ça a été fait à une certaine époque, quand le Koweït de Saddam Hussein a décidé de prendre le contrôle, l'Irak de Saddam Hussein a décidé de prendre le contrôle du Koweït. Ah, bah là, il y a eu une intervention justifiée, hein, disant non, ça on n'en veut pas. Je ne parle pas de 2003, bien sûr. Voilà. C'est des choses comme ça qu'il faut effectivement pouvoir réinventer. Et je pense qu'effectivement, cette réinvention, elle se fera peut-être à des échelles régionales, beaucoup plus que par le haut. Il faut reconstruire avec des échelles régionales, avec des projets communs, avec des raisons à agir ensemble, mais à accepter que ce ne soit pas que sur l'économique. Donc redéfinir des espaces de droit, voilà, où on a envie de faire ensemble. Et si on arrive à construire ça, peut-être qu'à un moment donné, brique par brique, zone par zone, voilà. Et accessoirement, et c'est un petit message à nos amis européens et américains, l'Occident est rejeté dans le monde de manière majeure, massive, pour de multiples raisons, y compris le fameux double standard qui, évidemment, faites ce que je dis, faites pas ce que je fais, pose quand même quelques questions, les leçons de morale, l'arrogance, l'interventionnisme, le surpoids américain. On adore les Américains en France, hein, parce que sans eux, on serait peut-être allemands, mais à un moment donné, voilà, la place économique, la place du droit, l'extraterritorialité, le dollar tous azimuts, tout ça, à un moment donné, si nous, on veut que le monde demain nous aime et pour bâtir avec le monde de nouvelles coopérations, il faudra peut-être aussi qu'on fasse quelques concessions sur la manière dont on entend nos rapports avec le monde. Voilà. Donc il y a de l'espoir, mais il y a du boulot.
Thank you. Some fantastic points there. I do want to return to the one about sort of building support for those shared rules as well, but I think I'll open that one up if I may, just that we can finish our opening comments with Tahinja. Your thoughts?
Au début, en français, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs pour m'avoir invité. C'est ma première fois au Maroc, un pays très joli et intéressant. Mais pour rendre la discussion plus efficace, je vais continuer à parler en anglais. Excusez-moi, je suis en train d'apprendre le français. Alors, I listened very closely to all the speakers today, and coming from Serbia, a Western Balkan country, yet to join the EU, and working at the European Policy Center, a top-ranked think tank from the region, focusing on EU affairs and EU enlargement, I tried to listen carefully and see to what extent the EU was seen as a relevant actor within the identified topic. If you exclude my French counterpart and the Croatian counterpart, that is the EU member states, we haven't seen the EU being mentioned at all by speakers coming outside of Europe. This sends a bleak picture and reaffirms the fact that EU is unfortunately currently out of the equation when we talk about geopolitics, or at least that's how the world perceives us. In terms of the EU, sometimes it is mentioned that indeed it has punched maybe above average, above its weight when it came to Ukraine in terms of the swiftness and the effectiveness of its assistance to Ukraine during the war. However, it has punched under the average expectations when it comes to the Israeli conflict and Palestinian at the moment. So in that sense, I think there's something missing in this picture. another arena that could be introduced to actually measure the effectiveness of EU's readiness to become a stronger geopolitical actor, and that is the enlargement policy. I've been working as a think tanker for the past 7 years, and I can tell you that enlargement simply wasn't on the agenda before the war started. And we as a think tank have been providing proposals, but we knocked on the doors, but the doors were unfortunately rarely open. But with the start of the war, we see that the EU has been, and member states are changing this realization, and they're increasingly realizing that the enlargement policy could become the EU's next big thing, that it could allow it to actually strengthen its capacities and turn into a more relevant geostrategic player. In terms of enlargement, I'm referring to both the new candidates that the Commission just proposed opening the session talks, such as Moldova and Ukraine, but also the old candidates, such as the Western Balkans 6, and of course my country in that regard. And having that said, we as a think tank, European Policy Center, have proposed something we have named a model for staged accession to the EU. On the one hand, it is supposed to guide the countries that want to become members, but that face many socioeconomic problems at the moment, even political problems. That the EU should invest in the future member states more to put them on their feet, as to make them join the EU as soon as possible while keeping the process merit-based. On the other hand, we have proposed that the EU should open up its institutions to have candidates sitting at the table, of course, without the voting rights, and therefore contribute to discussions and therefore participate in the geostrategic decisions that could have in consequence for the entire European continent. For example, Mr. Lajczak is here at the other panel, and once he said that, for example, during the pandemic, the EU simply forgot about the Western Balkans. A month later, it fixed some mistakes it made. It really, for example, donated a lot of masks and vaccines, but it was a bit too late because China came in a day after. And now, if you at least take a look at my country, people still believe China was the #1 donor at that time. So this was a big geopolitical blow. Secondly, during the war in Ukraine, the EU adopted a list of sanctions against Russia, but in the 4th sanctioning package, they also forgot about the Western Balkans to give an exemption, which it later rectified a month later, which had already caused big damage in the region that wants to join the EU, but as I mentioned, faces notable difficulties. That's why we argued that even before official membership, to have not only EU strategic autonomy, but European strategic autonomy, they should count more on the candidate countries and involve them in the work of the European Parliament, European Commission, European Council, and the Council of the EU. Of course, here I also refer to EU agencies and consultative bodies. On the other hand, our model envisions a future for the EU to make it more functional as well, because we all know that foreign policy in the EU is currently made by each and every member state. They decide by unanimity, and we understand Macron's concern that an extended number of veto players in the EU could make it, could render it more ineffective, unfortunately. That's why we propose for the benefits which I have just told you, increasing the economic benefits, increasing the institutional participation as early in the process as possible. The new member states would be expected to have their veto rights limited for a certain period of time. On the one hand, to demonstrate that they wouldn't backslide, that they would act constructively, and that they would actually positively contribute to making the EU a more relevant geostrategic player. And on the other hand, to encourage ongoing internal reforms of the EU, because we see, particularly with the insistence of France and Germany, that widening and deepening of the EU are through processes that go and should go alongside each other. To conclude, I've told you what we've done. We travel through capitals of the EU. However, we need more decisive action, and the big critical juncture will be in December of this year, where the European Council and the Council are supposed to set path for the future administration to inherit the new administration after the European Parliament elections next year. So in that sense, although Western Balkans is a small region, particularly from the perspective of this conference, I think if seen as a valuable asset, of course, along with new candidate countries, it could contribute to making the EU more relevant player and maybe to start feature more often in discussions like this. Thanks.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that's a fair challenge to the EU. I suppose you could think of it as trying to reinvent itself or change itself in line with other institutions that we've already touched on today. They are facing as big a challenge as many others as well. I indicated at the start, we'll come back to the general in a second, in 2 moments. Just if there are questions, so how many? Oh, we got 3 questions. General, if that's okay, I'll just take the 3 questions and then I'll come back to you first, if I may. So if we take them in a couple of, gentlemen there, gentlemen there, gentlemen there, if we do it in that order, and then we'll come back to the other 2 in a moment. We'll do the 3 first. I believe there's microphones if you don't have a microphone.
Oui, bonjour tout le monde, je suis Abdelhak Zgrari, je suis chercheur en migration et représentant de la société civile auprès des Nations Unies. Donc, le problème que je voulais soulever, et apparemment, donc, c'est la mort cérébrale de l'ONU. Le multilatéralisme est mort, il est bien mort bien avant 2003, comme vous l'avez souligné. Mais je crois que dès 1945, à la création de l'ONU, son objectif premier, c'était la paix et la prévention des conflits. Et qu'est-ce qu'on s'aperçoit? On s'aperçoit que depuis ce temps-là, les 2 blocs qui se sont constitués ont continué justement à occuper des pays voisins. L'URSS a annexé carrément toute l'Europe de l'Est. L'Europe de l'Ouest s'est fait vassaliser par les États-Unis avec le plan Marshall. Les guerres ont continué en Corée, au Vietnam, en Algérie, en Afrique. Et en 2003, le problème du Conseil de sécurité, ce n'est pas le veto, puisque le veto, il a été contourné par George Bush en embauchant avec lui une coalition, Coalition of Willings, pour aller attaquer l'Irak sans raison valable. Et qu'est-ce qu'on s'aperçoit? C'est que le droit international n'est plus respecté. Pas uniquement au niveau des institutions, mais au niveau de l'influence des pays qui constituent le Conseil de sécurité, qui, entre parenthèses, sont tous des marchands d'armes, parce qu'ils se vendent plus de 1000 milliards de dollars quotidiennement d'armes pour faire la guerre, alors qu'il y a 850 millions de personnes qui crèvent de faim ou qui souffrent de malnutrition. Voilà, c'était juste un commentaire.
Thank you. Next question.
Merci. Omar Benjeloun, je suis docteur en droit et avocat, représentant de la profession ici au Maroc. Moi, je ne vais pas parler la langue de Molière, je vais plutôt parler la langue de Hugo et de Jaurès. Vous avez parlé de la crise en Occident. Moi, j'aimerais juste faire une remarque et abonder dans ce sens que la crise de l'Occident est d'abord une crise conceptuelle. C'est-à-dire, on est en train de vivre un amalgame et une confusion sémantique et conceptuelle qui est extrêmement dangereuse. Lorsqu'on compare l'Ukraine à la Palestine, lorsqu'on compare les victimes et les agresseurs, lorsqu'on compare les civils et les militaires, cela devient dangereux. Comment est-ce que l'Occident, aujourd'hui, dans son mindset, arrive à confondre entre terrorisme et résistance? Comment est-ce qu'on peut éventuellement oublier que la résistance a été commune par les différents courants idéologiques en France devant le nazisme? Comment est-ce que l'Occident faisait partie de la solution? Comment est-ce que l'Occident faisait partie du bon se placer du bon côté de l'histoire pour s'opposer au fascisme et qu'aujourd'hui, nous renversons les dialectiques dans les différents terrains de conflit. Aujourd'hui, le peuple palestinien est en train de résister. Que cela s'appelle Hamas, FPLP ou autre, c'est une résistance devant l'agresseur. L'amendement numéro 2 de la Constitution américaine prévoit bien la prise d'armes devant un pouvoir qui oppresse son peuple. C'est la stricte vérité. Il n'y a pas d'avis ou d'opinion là-dessus. Le peuple palestinien est dans une situation d'occupation depuis 1948 et on ne peut pas parler de paix sans parler de justice. Sinon, nous faisons l'apologie de la force, d'une paix forcée qui ne sera jamais et absolument pas durable. La paix se constitue sur la justice et la seule justice dans le terrain, c'est de donner au peuple son droit à disposer de lui-même. C'est le droit international, c'est la charte universelle des droits humains et c'est la logique et la marche vertueuse de l'histoire. Merci.
Thank you, thank you. And the third question, gentleman there, yeah.
Vous m'entendez? Je m'appelle Youssef Kharoubi, Media and Communication Manager, Brussels International Center. J'avais une question, plus de commentaires à M. Trinquant, Kovac et M. Malafai. M. Trinquant, il a mentionné le manque d'importance actuelle des Nations Unies. Parce qu'on a remarqué dans la situation concernant la Palestine, le président il a fait plusieurs demandes de cessez-le-feu, mais on dirait que Netanyahou, Israël et les États-Unis, c'est comme s'ils n'avaient rien entendu. Alors à quoi ça sert les Nations Unies dans ce cas-là? C'est ça ma question. Monsieur Kovac et Monsieur Malafai, ils ont mentionné quelque chose concernant l'Union européenne. Monsieur Malafai, il a encore de l'espoir dans l'Union européenne, mais on remarque que l'Union européenne actuellement n'a aucun poids. C'est-à-dire que dans le conflit de la Russie et l'Ukraine, ils ont parlé, ils ont demandé de cesser le feu, mais personne n'a écouté et la Russie a continué à attaquer. Et dans la situation actuelle concernant la Palestine, l'Union européenne, il a fait un changement de speech, que ce soit la France et beaucoup de pays européens, et ils avaient tout d'abord été avec Israël, et là on a remarqué qu'il y a leur speech, leur position a changé par rapport à la Palestine. Mais malgré ça, malgré la force imaginaire de l'Union européenne, la situation continue à s'empirer en Palestine. À quoi ça sert alors l'Union européenne? C'est ça ma question.
Hello, I have a question myself. My name is Visal Beshirat. I am a student in the National School of Management and Business. I have a question for Mr. Ramel, I guess. I'm sorry if I... So my question is, you mentioned the conflict in Gaza and the terrorism of Hamas and the attacks for Israel. For you, Mr. Ramel, what's terrorism? What's the definition of terrorism? Because for me, terrorism is attacking civilians, killing children, and killing women. And this is exactly what Israel has been doing since the Nakba, since 1948.
Thank you. I will take one question because I do realise I took 3 men and didn't ask any women, so I am going to rectify that as well. Yes. It should kick in with any luck. If not, there should be a microphone that comes round.
Oui. Bonjour. Bonjour, c'est Madame Amina Médier, enseignante de langue française, femme de lettres. Je reviens à la citation du fameux philosophe français Voltaire au XVIIIe siècle qui citait tout le temps que dans une guerre, il n'y a pas de gagnant, hein, c'est perdant-perdant. Vie humaine, ne parlons pas de matériel et autre chose. Alors, pendant que le monde court derrière toutes ces guerres avec tout le matériel qu'ils ont, que les grandes puissances ont, les carnets de commandes des grandes usines qui sont remplis maintenant au lieu de fabriquer de la nourriture hein, pour toute l'humanité, en cours maintenant vers la commercialisation des armes pour détruire la vie humaine. Et autour de toute cette table, on a parlé de cette force, cette grande puissance, cette supériorité, alors qu'il y a plus de personnes faibles que de personnes fortes dans le monde. Pourquoi ne s'adresse-t-on pas vers des solutions plus adéquates pour sauver l'humanité? Maintenant, les grandes puissances sont dans une phase d'impasse. Hein? Ils n'arrivent pas à trouver des solutions aux guerres. Ma seconde remarque, c'est que ne pensez-vous pas que c'est la force qui a créé le terrorisme? Cette attaque de Hamas vers Israël nous rappelle le 11 septembre. Est-ce que ce n'est pas le même scénario qui se répète? C'est la force qui a créé la faiblesse. Et cette faiblesse qui se détourne vers la force. Une manière de répondre. Merci.
Brilliant. Thank you for all those various questions. I'm going to come to Carola in a second to talk initially about the UN side of things, but I know the gentleman wanted to come back on a point first, so I'll let you go first, General, to come in, and then I'll go across to Carola, and then if others want to think, Bill, as well, I'll take indications of what you want to answer across those range of questions on the UN, obviously the role of Israel, power, terrorism, and particularly what constitutes terrorism as opposed to resistance. But General, if you want to come back on your points first.
Merci beaucoup. Et je reprendrai deux points en suivant camarade Alexandre Malafaille sur l'Europe. Quel bonheur de voir la Croatie et la Serbie assis à une même table et la Serbie voulant rejoindre la Croatie dans la même Union européenne. Moi qui ai été 3 ans en ex-Yougoslavie, je peux vous dire que c'est un grand bonheur. Et ceci simplement pour rejoindre ce que disait Alexandre, après des siècles de guerre en Europe, l'Europe a réussi à devenir un havre de stabilité et on a tellement de regrets que nos amis du Royaume-Uni n'aient pas bien compris ce que c'était que l'Europe, ce havre de stabilité qui permettait de devenir un aimant. Ça, c'est sur le premier point. Le deuxième point, c'est sur l'ONU. Alors, évidemment, l'ONU, c'est ce que je disais, c'est le bouc émissaire. L'ONU a tort de tout. Mais je rappelle simplement que la Charte des Nations Unies, ça commence par nous, les peuples des Nations Unies. C'est nous, l'ONU. C'est nous. Et aujourd'hui, lorsqu'on dit que l'ONU, ça ne marche pas, parce que c'est compliqué, je dis simplement, puisqu'on parle de Gaza actuellement, que pour la première fois, après un mois, il y a eu une résolution qui a été votée, où les Russes ont voté, où les Français ont voté, où les Américains se sont abstenus, donc n'ont pas mis de droit de veto. Alors vous me direz, c'est pas la révolution, c'est vrai, mais c'est un premier pas. Et si on veut inventer autre chose que l'ONU aujourd'hui, moi je veux bien, mais je dis qu'on a un système et qu'il faut le faire fonctionner, et on revient à un certain nombre d'interventions qui ont eu lieu sur, non pas l'intérêt de l'ONU, mais la gouvernance de l'ONU, c'est-à-dire le Conseil de sécurité, et en particulier le droit de veto. Et monsieur Subotic, juste une remarque, à l'Union européenne, il n'y a pas de droit de veto, il y a un consensus. Et le consensus, c'est le multilatéralisme. C'est-à-dire qu'à un moment, quand vous avez 9 voix pour, 6 voix contre, vous dites, OK, la décision est prise. Et il n'y a pas de droit de veto. Et je pense que ça, c'est un problème, mais comme le dit Alexandre Malafaille, on n'est pas au bout du compte pour que les Américains et les Russes, en particulier, abandonnent le droit de veto. Mais donc, je dis simplement que l'Union européenne, à quoi ça sert? Si, pardonnez-moi, mais les pays européens ne sont pas en guerre et ne rêvent même plus d'être en guerre les uns contre les autres. Souvenez-vous de ce qui se passait il y a 70 ans. Donc c'est quand même une belle réussite, une belle réussite. Et le système de fonctionnement peut être un modèle pour d'autres, et peut-être que le Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU devrait s'en inspirer. Voilà, merci.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jean. Carola, on the UN reform, that agenda, what you
Sorry, I'm going to talk about. I'm going to react to a few of the things that I've been listening to. I want to go back to. It's been mentioned that less developed countries, when they choose, they should choose. Well, if you've got democratic values and human rights, and we all agree that we all stand with those. If you look at some of the allies of the United States and some other developed countries, some of them have at least missed a few classes on democracy and human rights, let's be honest about that. So we go back to the notion of friends and interests, and I think that's the crucial thing, and that's what I was basically talking about. We have the notion we're being forced to choose according to democratic values and according to human rights, which we all, of course, uphold. But the truth is that that sometimes doesn't align with our interests, just as it happens to the United States and other countries. Now, the choice that less developed countries have, or the lack of choices, stems from, first of all, multilateralism not having delivered. It hasn't delivered on the path to development. We can see we're way off targets of SDG and Agenda 2030. We can see when some reforms, for instance, agricultural reforms that have WTO mandate, they're not being treated in WTO, but other topics keep appearing with new agendas, but old agendas that have mandates are still pending, and those affect less developed economies. Our colleague here talked about the pandemic. I didn't want to get into that because it's quite sensitive for less developed countries because we didn't get any vaccines for a very long time. My first dose, when I got my first dose of the vaccine, my friends and families in Europe were already on their second dose. So if we really want to talk about multilateralism and how it failed to deliver, well, that's the key. They were talking at WTO about the waiver for intellectual property rights. We're still talking about that, really. There hasn't been, even an MC, it hasn't been a proper conclusion on it. It's being left pending for next time, maybe next pandemic, maybe next ministerial conference. The first vaccines that we got in Argentina were from Russia and from China. People were not happy about being vaccinated by either Russia or Chinese vaccines, quite frankly. We were much happy when AstraZeneca arrived, but it was by age group. So my age group, we got AstraZeneca, but the older people got the Russian vaccines. And then they had to face the problems that because they weren't approved, they couldn't travel. When people started traveling, they couldn't travel because the Russian vaccine was not accepted. So that's the problems that you see in less developed countries. And that's also resulted in much longer lockdowns with a much higher blow to our economies. So we suffered economically a lot more, even though, of course, my country didn't manage the pandemic very well, I have to say, but our lockdown was particularly long. And it had to do with the lack of vaccination because we couldn't handle our health system collapsing, as we saw in other countries. Then so you see a world that's disengaged in multilateralism. You see a United States that has been disengaged with the Latin American region, for instance, for decades, and that's how China stepped in with offers that perhaps don't convince us, but it's the only offer we have on the table on this path to development. We see a European Union that's an environmental legislation machine maker that results in non-tariff barriers for our products and our means of production, and we can't keep up with the legislation making. So we end up in a world where the agendas are tilted towards developing countries. The talk is about microchips, is about green economy, is about, oh, well, I'm not importing products that have not been produced in a green way and transported in a green way. But you're talking about parts of the world that don't have access to communication. A lot of people don't even have access to electricity in parts of the less developed world. So the main topics of conversation that we hear in multilateral fora are completely alienated from the realities of the global south. I was head of delegation at G20 for Trade and Investment Group for 2.5 years while I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it was very clear what the outcome would be when you enter the room. It doesn't matter where we had 6, 10, 14 hours of negotiation, we knew what the outcome was going to be. The less developed countries sitting at that table had no agenda. Well, we had an agenda, but it was invisibilized all the time. And I think that's why I wanted to clarify, because perhaps in my first intervention I wasn't clear enough. So I think I think multilateralism is at a crucial road. It's being challenged, but we need to reinforce it because it's challenged. We need to reinforce it because the mechanism of formally talking, countries talking to each other about common world problems, even though we think different, is essential, more essential than ever. But we do need to have a much more balanced agenda. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, communication mixed with more, again, as been mentioned several times, the views of the people generally and being more responsive to people in different countries as across the world. Bill.
Yeah, I'll come on to the question that was directly posed to me, but before that, I just want to say to my colleague at the end, my fellow European colleague, who argued that new states coming into the European Union, as I understood him, should lose the veto over foreign policy making. I made clear in my remarks that I'm a strong pro-European and I hugely regret Brexit and Britain leaving the European Union. But I think any major European nation that was foolish enough to have a referendum, as we as a nation did, would have lost that referendum. And removing the veto over foreign policy matters for EU member states, I think, risks further distancing between citizens, the people, and the European project. And I would be very nervous about that, as I say, as a fellow European. I was asked directly the question, what is terrorism? Terrorism, to me, is the deliberate targeting of civilians, murdering them to further a political cause. And I will try to use my words carefully because we need dialogue on this issue more than ever before. But in my very strong view, Hamas is not the resistance. It was not elected by Palestinians. It oppresses Palestinians in Gaza and uses Palestinians as human shields and sacrifices their lives. We need legitimate Palestinian leadership. And we, the international community, need to pressure in that environment Israel to respect international humanitarian law, but we also need to press Israel for reform, ending the settlements and coming to the negotiating table. And when this conflict is ended, actually rigorously press for a two-state solution, which is the only long-term, fundamental, viable solution to the horrors that are taking place.
Thank you for addressing that. Mira, I know you wanted to come in, and then Milton afterwards.
Thank you. Concernant l'Union européenne. Donc l'Union européenne est une histoire particulière, c'est une réussite, c'est un projet de paix. Mais on oublie fréquemment comment ça a été possible que cette Union européenne se crée. Elle s'est créée parce que les États européens étaient faibles, détruits. Après la Première Guerre mondiale, et ensuite après la Seconde Guerre mondiale. L'Union européenne s'est créée parce que les États européens étaient faibles. Ils étaient contraints de coopérer ensemble, de travailler ensemble, pour avoir un avenir ensemble. Donc ce n'était pas un projet qui a été imposé venant de l'Europe. L'Union européenne a été créée, la communauté européenne a été créée principalement à cause des intérêts des Américains qui voulaient avoir un rempart en Europe contre l'Union soviétique. Ça, il faut le dire clairement. Et ça, elle s'est transformée, cette communauté européenne, en une Union européenne. On a aujourd'hui quelque chose qu'on apprécie beaucoup, une sorte de paradis post-national. Mais là, on a un problème. Si l'on veut résoudre des problèmes dans le monde, notre voisinage, il faut s'émanciper de ce rêve post-national. Parce qu'on a résolu aucune crise en Europe. La crise en ex-Yougoslavie, est-ce qu'elle a été résolue par l'Union européenne ou par la communauté européenne? Non. Les États-Unis, Dayton Peace Accords, signé à Paris. La crise en Ukraine, est-ce qu'on a résolu la crise en Ukraine? Non. La crise aujourd'hui en Israël, quel rôle de l'Union européenne? Il n'y a pas de rôle, il y a un rôle symbolique. Donc, c'est un modèle qui fonctionne pour l'Europe, pour l'Union européenne, il n'y a pas de guerre, on peut être fier de cela, mais si l'on veut jouer un rôle dans le monde, il faut commencer à agir différemment. Mais là est un grand problème. Est-ce qu'on est prêt à rompre avec ce monde qui est une sorte de... avec cette Union européenne qui est une sorte de paradis? C'est la question qu'il faut se poser. Et d'où la peur chez les dirigeants principaux dans les pays principaux dans l'Union européenne. On a peur de cela en Allemagne. On a peur de cela en France. On ne veut pas s'engager. Donc, on a une contradiction. Il faut la dépasser. Et cette crise maintenant en Israël serait la possibilité pour l'Union européenne de s'engager et de dire aussi à nos amis américains, voilà, Israël mène la guerre contre le Hamas. Oui, maintenant il faut trouver vraiment un moyen pour imposer une solution d'avoir 2 États. Voilà. Mais je ne vois pas ça. On a vu comment l'Union européenne ou les États membres ont voté pour la résolution de l'Assemblée générale. Il y avait 4 pays qui étaient contre cette résolution. Il y avait 15 pays, si je ne me trompe pas, qui étaient pour, et il y avait quelques-uns qui sont abstenus. Voilà, c'est la réalité. Donc il n'y a pas de position commune. Donc je suis réaliste. J'aimerais être idéaliste, malheureusement je suis réaliste.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry. Neil, yes.
Look, what is happening in Ukraine is wrong. Russia is totally wrong. What is happening in Gaza is a loss to international law and human rights. They are the losers in this war. And I, as a former foreign minister, I'm supposed to be diplomatic. I will not be diplomatic here. We cannot sit here and say that killing of children, women, civilian, while I do respect Israel's right to defend itself, that is not defense. That is not defense. We're basically, let's say it what it is, it's genocide. If it was genocide in the former Yugoslavia, if it was genocide in Rwanda, what is the difference? What is the difference? Why we want to play around, and this is why I say it's an illusion that is being created. This thing could have been solved within minutes if the world order really wanted to stop this. More than 30 days, and we're still talking about the defense. I'm sorry, but that's how I see it. Thank you.
No, thank you. Look, you know, views coming across very clearly on all sides on the conflict, which we can continue to explore in a moment. But no, Alexander wants to come in next, and then yeah.
Merci beaucoup. Juste un commentaire sur l'ordre mondial de 45. Il est né en 43 avec les accords de Yalta. Et je pense que c'est parce que ces accords ont partagé le monde en deux que l'Union européenne, enfin ceux qui étaient sur le continent européen ont décidé de faire l'Union européenne pour avoir un espace qui serait différent de cet affrontement. Et alors certes, il est imparfait. Je réponds ici à ceux qui pensent que sur un plan politique, il y a beaucoup à faire. Oui, il n'y a pas d'union politique européenne au vrai sens du terme, sauf cas par cas. Mais c'est normal, c'est un peu consubstantiel, lié au modèle tel qu'il a été pensé et voulu. Mais on se soigne. Je pense que l'Union européenne, petit à petit, notamment sous l'effet des crises, va se renforcer sur sa capacité à peser politiquement. Elle n'est pas inerte non plus. Juste pour rappeler qu'en Palestine, à Gaza, Le premier soutien financier, c'est l'Union européenne, juste le dire, et qu'accessoirement, l'ONU a perdu 100 des siens dans le continent, enfin dans le conflit à Gaza. Moi, ce que je crois, c'est qu'en de façon, on pourra chacun avoir sa vision du monde sur ce qui se passe à Gaza et en Israël, mais l'affrontement, au-delà du terrain sur place, l'affrontement par tribune ou médias interposés ou enceintes interposées n'amènera à rien. La qualification, pour l'instant, comme vous le faites, de génocide, ce sont des débats, on verra, il faudra qu'il y ait un moment donné qu'il y ait une instance qui s'en charge. Mais je crois que notre rôle à nous, c'est d'essayer de chercher à reconstruire et à voir comment on peut trouver des chemins. Est-ce que c'est 2 États? J'en sais rien. Il y a d'autres formules, il y a 8 schémas possibles qui permettront demain d'en sortir. Ce qui est vrai, c'est qu'il y a un avant et un après. Ce qui s'est passé là ne s'est jamais passé avant depuis la création de l'État d'Israël. Donc là, il y a eu un choc, il y a une masse, il y a une guerre. Voilà. Donc après une guerre, en général, il se passe quelque chose de différent d'avant une guerre. Voilà, ça, c'est une raison, entre guillemets, d'espérer. Mais ça sera valable si on évite que la guerre sur place, qui n'est pas terminée, ne dégénère pas en guerre partout. Nous, on voit en France les tensions au sein de notre propre pays sur ce sujet, parce qu'on a une population qui a beaucoup évolué, et dans laquelle maintenant, effectivement, il y a des populations qui sont partie prenante ou qui se sentent concernées. Mais si on s'affronte chez nous, on ne réglera pas le problème sur place. Il va falloir qu'on trouve de manière intelligente la façon de les aider. Et puis, je voudrais rappeler quand même que, en reprenant le petit propos de Paul Valéry, on parle encore de vie humaine, hein, j'entends toutes les sensibilités et les douleurs, mais n'oublions pas qu'il y a aussi beaucoup d'idiots utiles ou de peuples utiles, hein. Pardon de le dire et de le répéter. Parce que ceux qui encouragent des gens à prendre une voiture bélier pour se faire sauter ou mettre une ceinture explosive pour se faire sauter quelque part, ce qu'on ne fait plus au sein du continent européen et entre pays européens, ce qu'on a peut-être pu faire par le passé, hein, dans d'autres ça, mais voilà, ceux qui les encouragent ne sont pas ceux qui le font, hein, une fois de plus. Donc on accepte le sacrifice des autres quand on est chef, mais par contre on ne se sacrifie pas soi-même. Donc j'aimerais bien dire qu'à un moment donné, il y a aussi beaucoup de manipulation, beaucoup d'intérêt, et qu'en ce qui concerne effectivement le conflit israélo-palestinien, et Gaza, le jour où les pays arabes prendront leurs responsabilités autrement qu'en décidant effectivement que le projet c'est de sortir Israël de la zone, ça ira. Parce que ça n'arrivera pas. Et la résolution que vous appelez de vos voeux, même si le Conseil de sécurité votait, et alors, il se passera quoi avec un État qui a peut-être une bombe atomique? Il se passera quoi? Je ne suis pas sûr que la solution passera. Vous allez envoyer quoi? Les forces américaines débarquer sur le territoire israélien? Vous y croyez un instant? Moi, j'y crois pas un instant. Voilà, je ne crois pas qu'on paiera le prix du sang pour arrêter ça. Donc, il faudra trouver d'autres leviers que ça. Et il faudra trouver d'autres leviers que celui qui vise effectivement à s'affronter. Alors oui, je rêve comme vous d'une Union européenne capable de peser davantage sur un plan politique. Mais en effet, c'est un chemin qui sera compliqué parce qu'il faudra que chacun des États, ça s'appelle la solidarité et la subsidiarité, chacun des États effectivement accepte à un moment donné de lâcher des prérogatives. La France est une puissance nucléaire. À un moment donné, comment on partage ça? La France est une puissance militaire importante encore. Comment est-ce qu'on partage les prérogatives d'engagement, de commandement? Tout ça, ce sont des questions qui sont extrêmement importantes. Voilà, c'est une construction, mais les États-Unis se sont faits en 200 ans. Ils ne sont pas faits tout seuls. Notre continent a 80 à 70 ans, on va dire, de maturité politique. Au moins, on a appris le respect de la vie. Et moi, j'encourage toutes les zones autres du monde qui rêvent d'un monde plus pacifique, de faire le respect de la vie déjà dans leur propre zone géographique, et puis d'essayer de voir comment ils peuvent construire des architectures régionales de paix et de sécurité, mais engageantes et contraignantes, pour que ça fonctionne. Le continent africain, il y aurait pas mal de choses à dire, et dans d'autres zones du monde aussi. Voilà, pour faire la paix, il faut le vouloir, et pas toujours attaquer le vieux monde qui a ses défauts, mais qui doit se réformer, ça c'est très clair, doit changer son mindset par rapport au reste du monde. Mais je pense que de toute façon, notre rôle, je le redis, c'est pas de chercher à cliver encore les débats tels qu'ils le sont, à polariser, mais c'est plutôt d'essayer de dire, ok, il y a des problèmes, mais il faut trouver des solutions, et il faut que ces solutions, effectivement, elles soient intelligentes et que chacun prenne ses responsabilités, que chacun les prenne, ne pas de manière cynique, mais que chacun prenne ses responsabilités. Sinon, on continuera comme ça, cas un cas, jusqu'à une troisième guerre, hein, c'est possible.
Okay, thank you. As the ideas have raised some concerns, I'd like to address them. First of all, I'm not too happy as well that we need to discuss the possibility of limiting certain rights of newcomers into the EU. However, we were clearly told by France and other big players in the EU, future enlargement won't happen by having newcomers to the club with veto rights, therefore risking having 6 or 9 new Hungaries, therefore putting new conditions along the way. So we're not too happy about it, but is the solution to be proud and just quit? We don't think so, because it's dangerous for geopolitical reasons, both in our countries, but in the entire European continent. That's why we found this compromise solution. In that sense, unanimity is required in the Council, whereas, as the gentleman over there mentioned, the consensus is required in the European Council. Therefore, newcomers, according to our proposal, will participate in consensus building in the European Council. However, in the Council, not only in foreign policy, but in other areas, they would, on the one hand, temporarily have their veto rights being taken away. It doesn't mean they wouldn't be able to participate in qualified majority voting, in simple majority voting decisions, and so on and so forth. They would fully participate in the European Parliament, in the Commission, in the Court of Justice. Therefore, they would be full members with a compromise solution, a temporary derogation that is, to limit their veto rights for a certain period of time. And although from British perspective, I know that this would rattle the public and this would be unimaginable to pass, but from the perspective of our region, for example, my country has been on its EU path for the past 2 decades. Montenegro, Macedonia, other countries as well. I'll tell you what the Macedonian foreign minister said recently in Berlin at the European conference. He said, European integration process for us is not about veto rights. It's about assisting us to put our democracies on their feet, to decrease the socioeconomic convergence between or the socioeconomic gap between the EU and the Western Balkans, and therefore to try to overcome these issues. We want to join the single market, we want to have access to structural funds, we want to participate in consensus building, while understanding that EU needs more time to internally reform itself. So truly, we would temporarily create a differentiation between conventional and new member states, but in a way we're proposing an avant-garde regime, that is a regime towards which the EU is currently aiming to reach. Currently there are talks about reducing veto rights in other areas as well, including foreign policy, but not only foreign policy related. We saw the president of the European Council, Charles Michel, therefore supposedly representing all member states, talking about, for example, limiting the veto rights for future enlargements. Let's say Serbia joins first, it wouldn't be able to block Albania on that matter if Albania was lagging behind. So those are just some creative ideas that were supposed to help our countries join the club, but also to understand that the EU needs more time to continue internally reforming itself so it could preserve its values while also becoming a more geopolitically relevant player in the future. Yeah, I give the floor back.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, Amanan, I'll come to Ilan in a couple of bits as well. And gee, I'm not going to forget you as well, so don't worry.
I will speak in Arabic again. عندما تغيب العدالة والمساواة يغيب الاحترام للمؤسسات الدولية، ويمكن أن نتوقع من الضعفاء أن يقوموا بأي ردة فعل للحصول على حقوقهم. رئيسة المفوضية الأوروبية أورسولا فون دير لاين عندما تم حصار ماريوبول وقطع الماء والغذاء عن المواطنين الأوكران قالت إن هذا جريمة حرب. وعندما قرر مسؤولو دولة الاحتلال الإسرائيلي قطع الماء والغذاء والكهرباء عن المدنيين والمستشفيات الفلسطينيين، هي نفسها قالت حق إسرائيل في الرد. ازدواجية المعايير تفقد المؤسسات الدولية المفترض أن تكون محترمة قيمتها. لذلك هذه الشعوب، وأريد أن أتحدث عن الشعوب الأوروبية والأمريكية، لقد تفوقت على سياسيها. المنظومة الأخلاقية لدى الشعوب الأوروبية كانت راقية في الحكم على الصورة. أعتقد أننا في القرن 21 وفي العقد الثالث من القرن 21. عار علينا نحن هنا في هذه القاعة، وعار على كل المثقفين والسياسيين في العالم إذا لم يقوموا بإدانة جرائم الحرب وجرائم الإبادة التي تقوم بها قوة نووية مثل إسرائيل ضد مدنيين عزل. الرد الإسرائيلي فاق حدود الرد على ما حدث في 7 أكتوبر. الظلم الذي تعرض له الشعب الفلسطيني منذ عام 48 هو أوصل إلى مثل هذه النتائج. النفاق الغربي والنفاق الدولي الذي مارسوه على الضعفاء الفلسطينيين لعشرات السنوات أخرج مثل هذا الوضع الذي نعيش فيه. ولكن من منكم يستطيع أن يجلس وينظر في عيون أطفاله في منزله عندما يشاهدون أطفال فلسطين يذبحون ويقتلون بدون أي ذنب، لا يحملون أسلحة؟ هذه المستشفيات، الأطفال الخدج الذين يقتلون وبتصريح من مسؤولين إسرائيليين بأنهم ينوون فعل ذلك ويفعلون. ونأتي هنا البعض للأسف يريد أن يعطي justification، يعطي الحق لإسرائيل بما تقوم به. يجب أن لا نساوي بين الضحية والجلاد، ويجب أن نسمي الأمور بمسمياتها. إسرائيل دولة احتلال، والشعب الفلسطيني هو محتل. قبل وجود حماس كانت إسرائيل ترتكب المجزرة تلو المجزرة من دير ياسين إلى صبرا وشتيلا، لم تكن هناك حماس. إذا كان يعتقد البعض أن القضاء على حماس وعلى منظمة التحرير وعلى فتح وعلى جبهة شعبية وكل حركات النضال الفلسطيني قد انتهى الشعب الفلسطيني، إذا بقي فلسطيني واحد فقط على قيد الحياة وفي أستراليا موجود، سوف يطالب ويذهب إلى ويناضل من أجل استعادة حقوقه شرعية، وفلسطين دولة عربية مستقلة وعاصمتها القدس. وشكرا لكم.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Marissa, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the discussion has gone through so many different iterations because we're looking at, you know, going back to the theme that you introduced, Stuart, war and peace, a new Cold War era, and the future of multilateralism. And my colleague, Monsieur Abu Jaza, just talked about how a lot of these international institutions are viewed, particularly by the global south, particularly when we're looking at conflicts in different regions. And that goes back to one of the primary premises that you introduced, which is trust in these multilateral institutions. We know that there is a lack of trust in many of these institutions, and of course it varies from region to region. But there's also, going back to your comments earlier about the rise of populism, there's also trust in national institutions by various factions for different reasons, and it's manifesting itself, of course, through forces that are pro-democracy, focused on protecting democratization, the rule of law, human rights, and other forces that are more populist, or movements that are more populist, that are challenging the very basic premises of these of democracy. And the question goes back to, well, how do we rebuild trust? What are the confidence building measures that are available to us as we're confronted with all these multiple crises? Because the additional components that we see in a lot of these conflicts today, whether it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the war in Gaza, is how information, disinformation, and misinformation is playing a critical role in shaping perceptions, in shaping hearts and minds, to go back to phrases that were used in the previous era. And I think we're looking at an increasingly polarized world in terms of public opinion, and the pressures are on from within a lot of these countries that we see, particularly witnessing war and conflict and their immediate environments. And so, this is more of a multiple questions that we need to ask ourselves as we move ahead through different pathways, and perhaps try to get creative about, well, how do we move forward with the day after? How do you rebuild trust after all these barriers have been broken? There is a lot of anger and a lot of grief in a lot of these conflicts, and it's going to take at least a generation for people to come together. But that's where the responsibility lies back with decision makers, with policymakers, with thinkers and thought leaders, to try to bring institutions together. You know, we haven't talked about the role of civil society organizations. You know, track to diplomacy. Monsieur Malafay mentioned why haven't we mentioned the people in your introductory remarks? And I think that's one of the elements that is missing from the conversation, because we see governments acting in one direction or making decisions in one direction, and public opinion or the public at a very different on a very different wavelength. And so it is going to be a very challenging path forward, but these questions have to be asked, and these efforts have to be invested in. I've seen so many reports about defunding a lot of these initiatives that worked to bring people together in Israel and Palestine. You know, organizations that have worked for peace, for dialogue, for just basic understanding of the other and the other's narrative. And that is the time where we need to do a lot more to ensure that this dialogue continues. It's going to be a very, very long road, but these questions have to be asked, and these ideas have to be brought together through dialogue.
Brilliant, thank you. I realise we're now running, we've got about 10 minutes left, and I've definitely got 3 people to include, if not others if they want to come in again. Sam first, then Ilan, and Gina. I was just thinking more generally, picking up on the point about trust, if there's a point that you want to make about trust in institutions particularly. But yeah, thank you.
Well, first of all, I'm extremely happy because the whole purpose for me to travel here has already fulfilled itself. It's a very enriched discussion that really widens the perspective of how the different conflicts are perceived in the different parts of the world. And also the multipolarism becomes really in of the topic, because the whole point of physically multipolarism means that the polars that are pushing each other apart. And there are regimes in the world who are clearly seeing as benefiting from that. And I think a lot of these crises ongoing are being harnessed on top of this polarization now. And I think our job as a sort of freedom-loving, international law-based country, we need to do our job to remedy this and then build trust, as you just spoke about. I wanted to clear one injustice, I think, that has been done towards the international organization, as well, the European Union, and I also want to mention NATO, although it isn't been mentioned here. You know, what was the reason why Finland decided to, over the 70 years, he wants to join NATO? What was the trigger? Well, the trigger was in December 21, when Russia put forward these papers, demands, ultimatums for the West. And the first point of this letter said that Ukraine, Georgia, and others should not have access to NATO. This was the verbalization of the sphere of influence. And Finland, as Sweden, was ridden with milk there. This was the trigger. After 70 years of being non-allied, they decided that this is enough, because there was another great power that said that we will have our will over you. When we speak about European Union and also with Palestine, then European Union has biggest supporter of Palestine on all the parameters, what you can measure in euros, in percentages, people, training days, humanitarian convoys, everything. European Union has been advocating for peace, advocating for two-state arrangement for years. So I think we are doing a little bit unjust to this organization here. And I think what our colleague from Serbia was mentioning, the mere fact that European Union is becoming more attractive is the same manifest that there are nations who want to benefit from that, understanding that the freedom, rule of law-based world is something that will give you more prosperity and safety than the other forms of rule. And I think that is the sort of common ground that we need to build on, and find the common areas, and then it will be much easier also to settle on the areas where we are not on agreement.
Brilliant, thank you. Ilan.
Sure. Thank you. No, I'm delighted I went after Mr. Kusti because I fully subscribe to the Estonian view of sort of the dangers of Russian predation. And so let me inject something here because I think it's necessary to sort of to zoom out a little bit and to set the table. Because we're actually it's useful to understand what the sort of the strategic drivers are that we're actually talking about. This conversation has left me, I would say, very pessimistic about the state of multilateralism. And part of the reason, I would argue, is imperialism, right? What we're actually talking about in the context of Ukraine, although we haven't said the word, is it's Russian imperialism. Russia covets Ukraine because Kievan Rus in the Middle Ages was the largest nation state in Europe, and it's the seat from where the Russian Empire sprang. A Russia without Ukraine is just Russia. A Russia with Ukraine is Greater Russia, right? And this is what drives, this is what animates. But listen, I'm Russian. My parents are were born in the Soviet Union, so I know very well that there's an old Russian proverb that says that the appetite comes with the eating. So how we respond to Russian imperialism, to this neo-imperial conception of a greater Russia, determines a great number of things for the European Union, for NATO, for the stability and the prosperity of Eastern Europe, sort of writ large, the Balkans, other regions. But from an American perspective, this is only 1/3 of the problem because I think this is not mentioned enough, but it's necessary to understand that America, strategic planners in the United States that are really taking the 60,000-foot view are seeing not one imperial problem in Russia, but three. They're seeing a revived imperial impulse on the part of China, right? The Belt and Road Initiative at least initially, was an attempt to create an empire of influence, right? Now, the Belt and Road has gone through different permutations. They are sort of being a little bit more circumspect with their investments, but the idea of creating a sphere of influence is very much embedded in the DNA of the Belt and Road. And you're also seeing, and you've seen over the last decade in this region and also in the Middle East, Iranian imperialism, right? There's sort of the growth of an Iranian, again, not a full empire the way the Persian Empire was an empire, but an area of asymmetric influence, right? And this is all existing, and it all sort of overlays all these conversations about multilateralism, because what you're seeing in Ukraine, what you're seeing in China, for example, in the context of the Uyghur Muslim minority, which Minister Findlay didn't talk about when he talked about genocide, although I think it should very much be put on the table. You're seeing the subjugation of peoples, right, in the service of great power aspirations. So the only thing I would advise here is that when we're talking about multilateralism, when we're talking about what Marissa talked about, I think very correctly, how to look at creating understanding people-to-people exchanges, we have to understand that there are historic forces. To invert what Francis Fukuyama said, we're watching the return of history, right? And we're watching imperial forces that have a very profound influence over whether multilateralism succeeds or fails.
Brilliant, thank you. Look, I'm just going to make sure the organisers give us a few more minutes as well, because I know we've got a couple of minutes left, because I want to give Gina plenty of time to give us a sort of hopefully an upbeat way to maybe overcome some of Ilan's pessimism from the last couple of hours with any luck.
You really put the burden. Upbeat,
Sorry,
seriously?
yeah, I know.
Okay, so in institutions and in the word trust, we have the challenge as citizens of the world and as leaders with regard to definitions. When we talk about words like genocide or resistance, what do those words mean? And the challenge is we don't agree on them. So we have to pick and choose and decide where we're going to bend at the edges to come to some sort of agreement. Whether it's institutions, and I'll end with the positive one. So I'm thinking about my own country, and again, 30 years of diplomacy and being the drafter of human rights reports around the world, different assignments, of being the drafter of trafficking in persons reports around the world and different assignments, and recognizing that our human rights report, people challenge us on it. Are we being consistent? Are we criticizing our partners as fairly as we are those who are not our partners when we're calling out human rights abuses, or indeed trafficking in persons? And I must say I'm far more comfortable with the trafficking in persons report because the United States is listed in that and in not the, doing a perfect job in trafficking in persons. So there's a recognition of our failings along with the rest of the world. Where I take hope in international institutions and multilateralism is in that discussion a lack of success so far, but in sustainable development goals, and particularly with regard to women, peace, and security. As the United Nations has addressed that, as nations around the world have talked about a feminist foreign policy and really baking in women into institutions of peace and security, the recognition that when women are part of delegations for negotiations, for resolving conflict, that it's more successful if we are at the table. And all of these conversations would not even exist if it weren't for the United Nations, if it weren't for multilateralism in raising these issues and putting forth solutions. We haven't got there yet, but the solutions are out there. We recognize them. Even countries that might not be putting women at the table at least are talking the talk if they are not walking the walk. And therefore, I have hope in multilateralism and in building trust as we move forward, and I'll stop there.
Fantastic. I think you did a very good job at being a bit more optimistic than we've managed in the rest of the session. Look, we've come to the end of our time. It's been impossible for me to summarise everything that's been said. But I suppose what I just want to do is thank MEDays for organising today's excellent discussion. The participants around the table for their fantastic contributions and responding, and hopefully responding, fully to the questions, and obviously to the audience for participants. US participants for coming along as well. So look, thank you everyone for your time today, and there's plenty more excellent sessions to look forward to for the rest of the day. Thank you very much. I think participants, we get a picture of.